What happens when a woman who has buried 3 husbands walks into a room full of naval officers who think they know everything about power? What happens when those same officers discover that the quiet widow sitting across from them controls more firepower than their entire fleet? In 1943, while the world was tearing itself apart in the greatest war humanity had ever seen, one woman sat in a conference room in Washington, D.C., listening to Admiral Chester Nimitz explain why her little contribution to the war effort was appreciated but ultimately insignificant. The other officers chuckled. After all, what could a woman from a small town possibly know about naval warfare? 30 minutes later, those same officers sat in stunned silence as they realized they had just insulted the most powerful shipbuilder in America. The woman they had dismissed as a grieving widow actually controlled the largest private naval construction empire on the East Coast. She had the power to build or destroy their entire Pacific campaign with a single phone call. Her name was Margaret Whitmore, but history would remember her as the Iron Widow. This is the story of how a woman who was supposed to disappear into quiet mourning instead became the secret weapon that helped win World War II. It's a story of power, respect, and what happens when you underestimate someone who has already survived more than you can imagine. The Admiral thought it was a joke. He wouldn't be laughing for long. Margaret Whitmore had always known that death would be her most faithful companion. By the age of 45, she had buried 3 husbands, each one taken by circumstances that seemed to mock the very idea of a peaceful life. But on this gray morning in November 1943, as she sat in her Cadillac outside the imposing brick buildings of the Washington Navy Yard, she wasn't thinking about death. She was thinking about power. The driver, a nervous young man named Timothy who had been with her family for only 6 months, kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror. Margaret understood his anxiety. Most people became uncomfortable around her after learning about her history. 3 dead husbands by age 45 was the kind of coincidence that made people whisper about curses and bad luck. They didn't understand that Margaret had never been unlucky. She had simply been married to brave men who lived dangerous lives. Her first husband, James Whitmore, had been a brilliant engineer who specialized in naval architecture. They had met at a society dinner in Newport when she was just 22, fresh out of Wellesley College with a degree in mathematics that her father had insisted she pursue. James was 10 years older, already making a name for himself, designing merchant vessels that could carry cargo faster and safer than anything else on the water. Their courtship had been brief, but intense, filled with long conversations about ship design and ocean currents that most women of her social class would have found unbearably tedious. Margaret found them fascinating. They married in the spring of 1920, and for 8 wonderful years, she had watched James build what would become the foundation of the Whitmore Shipbuilding Company. She wasn't just a wife during those years, she was a partner. While James handled the engineering and design work, Margaret managed the business side with a precision that amazed everyone who worked with them. She negotiated contracts, managed finances, and developed relationships with suppliers that would prove invaluable in the years to come. James died in 1928, killed when a new engine design exploded during testing. The investigation later revealed that a competitor had bribed one of the workers to sabotage the engine, but by then, James was already buried in the family plot overlooking the harbor. Margaret was 29 years old and, suddenly, in control of a company that employed over 300 people. The board of directors, all men who had worked with James since the company's founding, assumed that Margaret would sell her shares and retire to a life of comfortable widowhood. They had underestimated her completely. Instead of selling, Margaret threw herself into learning every aspect of the shipbuilding business. She spent months in the shipyards, wearing coveralls and hard hats, asking questions and taking notes. The workers, initially skeptical of their new female boss, gradually came to respect her attention to detail and her willingness to listen to their suggestions. More importantly, they began to trust her because she never asked them to do anything she wouldn't do herself. Within 2 years, Margaret had expanded the company beyond James's original vision. She diversified into military contracts, sensing that the political situation in Europe would eventually require American involvement. By 1932, Whitmore Shipbuilding was producing destroyers for the Navy and cargo vessels for civilian clients. The company was thriving under her leadership. It was during this period of growth that Margaret met her second husband, Captain Robert Harrison. Robert was a decorated Navy officer who had been assigned to oversee the military contracts at Whitmore Shipbuilding. He was a career military man, serious and dedicated, but he had a gentle sense of humor that Margaret found irresistible. More importantly, he respected her business acumen and never questioned her authority within the company. Their marriage in 1933 was a more subdued affair than her first wedding, but it was no less meaningful. Robert understood that he was marrying not just a woman, but a business empire, and he embraced his role as both husband and unofficial consultant. His military experience proved invaluable as Margaret continued to pursue government contracts, and his connections within the Navy Department opened doors that might have remained closed to a civilian contractor. For 6 years, they worked together to build Whitmore Shipbuilding into one of the most respected naval contractors on the East Coast. Robert's insights into military requirements helped Margaret design vessels that exceeded Navy specifications, while her business sense ensured that the company remained profitable even during the lean years of the mid-1930s. Robert died in 1939, killed in a training accident when his aircraft crashed during a routine navigation exercise. The official report blamed mechanical failure, but Margaret knew that Robert had been testing a new navigation system that he believed could give American pilots a crucial advantage in the war that everyone knew was coming. He had died trying to protect his country, and Margaret honored his sacrifice by throwing herself even more deeply into the war effort. By 1940, Whitmore Shipbuilding was producing vessels faster than any other private contractor in the United States. Margaret had expanded the operation to include 3 separate shipyards and employed over 2,000 workers. She had also married again, this time to Commander William Thorne, a submarine specialist who had worked closely with Robert on several projects. William was different from her previous husbands. Where James had been intellectual and Robert had been dutiful, William was passionate. He believed deeply in America's obligation to stop fascism, and he threw himself into his work with an intensity that sometimes worried Margaret. But she loved his dedication, and she shared his conviction that their work was about more than profit or even patriotism. They were building the tools that free people would use to defend freedom itself. William died in 1942, killed aboard the USS Thresher when it was torpedoed by a German U-boat while testing new sonar equipment that he had helped design. Margaret received the news on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by a young ensign who could barely meet her eyes as he handed her the telegram. By Wednesday afternoon, she had already begun work on modifications to the sonar design that she believed could prevent similar attacks in the future. The press had begun calling her the Iron Widow by then, a nickname that was meant to be cruel but which Margaret had embraced. Iron was strong, iron was useful, and iron didn't break under pressure. If being an Iron Widow meant that she could honor the memory of her husbands by continuing their work, then she would wear the title proudly. By the time she received the invitation to attend the strategy meeting at the Washington Navy Yard, Margaret controlled the largest privately owned naval construction operation in America. Her ships were serving in the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the Mediterranean. Her designs had saved countless lives, and her production schedules were keeping the American Navy supplied with the vessels they needed to fight a global war. But as she sat in her Cadillac outside the Navy Yard, watching uniformed officers hurry through the November drizzle, Margaret knew that many of the men she was about to meet would see only a woman who had been widowed 3 times. They would assume that her success was due to luck, inheritance, or the guidance of more capable men. They would be polite, of course, because they needed her ships, but they would not take her seriously as a strategic thinker or military planner. That was their mistake. Margaret checked her watch and nodded to Timothy. It was time to remind the United States Navy that the Iron Widow was not just a supplier of ships. She was a weapon of war in her own right, and she was about to change the course of the Pacific campaign in ways that none of these officers could imagine. As she walked through the rain toward the entrance of the building where Admiral Nimitz was waiting, Margaret thought about James, Robert, and William. Each of them had died, believing that their work would help America win the war that was coming. Now it was her job to make sure they had been right. The meeting was scheduled to last 1 hour. Margaret intended to make every minute count. The conference room smelled of cigarettes and stale coffee, with an undertone of metal polish that reminded Margaret of her shipyards. 23 men sat around a massive mahogany table, their uniforms crisp and their expressions ranging from curious to skeptical. At the head of the table sat Admiral Chester Nimitz himself, a man whose reputation for strategic brilliance was matched only by his legendary impatience with civilians who wasted his time. Margaret was the only woman in the room, and she could feel the weight of their collective attention as she took her assigned seat near the middle of the table. The nameplate in front of her read simply Whitmore Shipbuilding, which she knew was a deliberate choice. Using her first name would have emphasized her gender, while using her full title might have given her more authority than these men were comfortable acknowledging. Admiral Nimitz called the meeting to order with the brisk efficiency of a man who had a war to win. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his eyes flickering briefly toward Margaret, "we're here to discuss the Pacific Campaign supply requirements for 1944. As you all know, our success in the island-hopping strategy depends entirely on our ability to maintain a steady flow of vessels, equipment, and supplies across distances that would have been unimaginable in previous conflicts." The Admiral gestured to a large map of the Pacific that dominated one wall of the conference room. Red pins marked Japanese-controlled territories, while blue pins indicated American positions. The vast expanse of ocean between them told the story of the challenge they faced. "Our current production schedules are adequate," Nimitz continued, "but barely. We need to discuss ways to increase output without compromising quality or depleting our reserves. Colonel Matthews will begin with an overview of our current capabilities." Colonel Matthews, a thin man with graying hair and wire-rimmed spectacles, stood and began reading from a thick folder of statistics. Margaret listened carefully, making notes in the leather portfolio that had belonged to William. As Matthews droned through production numbers and delivery schedules, she began to notice discrepancies between his figures and the reality she knew from her own operations. "According to our latest reports," Matthews was saying, "we're producing destroyers at a rate of 12 per month across all contractors. Escort vessels are being delivered at 28 per month, and cargo ships at 45 per month. These numbers represent a significant increase over 1,942 production levels." Margaret glanced around the table and saw heads nodding in approval. But she also saw something else in the faces of the more experienced officers present. They looked concerned, though they were trying to hide it. Margaret recognized that look because she had seen it in her own mirror during the darkest days of 1940, when the company was struggling to meet unprecedented demand with limited resources. When Matthews finished his presentation, Admiral Nimitz opened the floor for discussion. Several officers spoke about logistics challenges, supply chain issues, and the need for better coordination between civilian contractors and military planners. Margaret waited, listening carefully to each speaker and taking detailed notes. Finally, Admiral Nimitz turned to her. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his tone polite but dismissive, "I believe your company has been contributing to our escort vessel production. We appreciate your patriotic efforts, though I understand your operation is somewhat smaller than our primary contractors. Perhaps you could share any insights from your experience?" Margaret heard the subtle condescension in his tone, and she saw several officers exchange glances that clearly communicated their view that this was a waste of time. They were about to discover how wrong they were. "Thank you, Admiral," Margaret said, standing slowly. She moved to the map on the wall, her heels clicking sharply on the polished floor. "I'm afraid Colonel Matthews's figures are incorrect." A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Matthews himself looked startled, then offended. "I beg your pardon," he said. "Those figures come directly from the Bureau of Ships." Margaret smiled pleasantly. "I'm sure they do, Colonel, but they don't reflect reality." She turned to face the room, her hand resting on the map. "You see, gentlemen, I don't just run a shipbuilding company. I'm a shipbuilding industry on the East Coast." The silence that followed was so complete that Margaret could hear the ticking of the clock on the far wall. Admiral Nimitz leaned forward in his chair, his expression shifting from polite interest to sharp attention. "Perhaps you could elaborate, Mrs. Whitmore," he said carefully. Margaret had been waiting for this moment for months. She opened her portfolio and withdrew a single sheet of paper that she had prepared specifically for this meeting. "Certainly, Admiral. Whitmore Shipbuilding directly operates 7 shipyards from Maine to Virginia. We employ over 8,000 workers and maintain partnerships with 43 smaller contractors. Last month alone, we delivered 18 destroyers, 31 escort vessels, and 57 cargo ships to the Navy." She paused, letting those numbers sink in. Colonel Matthews was frantically flipping through his folder, his face growing pale as he searched for information that clearly wasn't there. "More importantly," Margaret continued, "we control the supply chains for steel, aluminum, and specialized electronics that your other contractors depend on. When Colonel Matthews reports that all contractors are producing 12 destroyers per month, he's actually describing the output of companies that couldn't function without components that we manufacture." Admiral Nimitz set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "Are you telling us that your company is responsible for more than half of our Pacific Fleet production?" "I'm telling you that my company is responsible for approximately 70% of all naval vessel production on the East Coast," Margaret replied. "And that the figures you're using to plan the 1944 campaign are dangerously optimistic." The room erupted in a flurry of whispered conversations. Margaret waited calmly while the officers processed what she had just told them. She had spent 3 years building this moment, using her connections and her business acumen to create a network of partnerships and dependencies that made Whitmore Shipbuilding indispensable to the war effort. Admiral Nimitz raised his hand for silence. "Mrs. Whitmore, these are very serious claims. If what you're saying is true, then our entire production planning process is flawed." "It is flawed, Admiral," Margaret said firmly, "but it's not irreparable. The problem is that your planning staff has been treating civilian contractors like vendors instead of partners. You've been measuring our output instead of understanding our capabilities." She moved back to her seat, but remained standing. "For example, you're currently asking us to produce escort vessels using specifications that were designed in 1940. But we've developed improvements that could increase their speed by 15% and their fuel efficiency by 20%. We've also created new radar systems that could give our ships a significant tactical advantage." Margaret paused again, watching as several officers leaned forward with obvious interest. "The reason you don't know about these improvements is that nobody has asked us for strategic input. You've treated us like a factory that fills orders instead of recognizing that we're engineers and innovators who understand naval warfare as well as anyone in this room." Commander Harrison, a young officer sitting near the Admiral, spoke up. "Mrs. Whitmore, are you suggesting that civilian contractors should be involved in tactical planning?" Margaret smiled at him with the patience of a teacher addressing a particularly slow student. "Commander, I'm suggesting that the people who design and build your ships might have valuable insights into how those ships can be used most effectively. My late husband, William, died testing sonar equipment that could have prevented the loss of 6 submarines in the past year. My engineers have developed armor plating that could save thousands of lives. But none of that matters if you continue to treat us like outsiders." Admiral Nimitz was studying her with the intensity of a man who was beginning to realize that he had seriously underestimated someone. "What exactly are you proposing, Mrs. Whitmore?" Margaret had been waiting for this question since the moment she received the invitation to this meeting. I'm proposing that we stop pretending this is a traditional war that can be won with traditional methods. The Pacific Campaign requires innovation, speed, and flexibility. You need ships that can adapt to new challenges, weapons that can give you tactical advantages, and production schedules that can respond to changing requirements. She opened her portfolio again and withdrew a thick document bound in blue covers. This is a comprehensive analysis of current Pacific operations, along with recommendations for technological improvements and production modifications that could change the course of the war. My staff and I have been working on it for 6 months. Margaret placed the document on the table in front of Admiral Nimitz. Everything in that report is based on actual combat data, engineering analysis, and production capabilities that exist right now. We're not talking about theoretical improvements or experimental technology. We're talking about changes that could be implemented within 90 days. The Admiral picked up the document and flipped through the first few pages. Margaret watched his expression change as he read, seeing the moment when he realized that what she was showing him wasn't the work of a grieving widow trying to be helpful. This was the product of a sophisticated military-industrial operation that understood the war better than his own planning staff. Mrs. Whitmore, Admiral Nimitz said slowly, "I believe we need to have a much longer conversation." The private meeting with Admiral Nimitz took place 3 days later in his personal office, a Spartanly decorated room that reflected the no-nonsense approach of America's most important naval commander. Margaret arrived precisely on time, carrying a leather briefcase that contained documents that would reshape the Pacific war strategy. This time, she wasn't sharing the room with skeptical officers who saw her as an intrusion. This time, she had the Admiral's complete attention. "Mrs. Whitmore," Nimitz began without preamble, "I've spent the past 72 hours reviewing your report with my most trusted advisors. What you've presented challenges everything we thought we knew about our own capabilities." Margaret sat across from the Admiral's desk, her hands folded calmly in her lap. "What specifically concerns you, Admiral?" "Let's start with your claim that we could increase destroyer production by 40% within 6 months, Nimitz said, referring to a document on his desk. "My staff says that's impossible given current steel allocation and workforce limitations." "Your staff is thinking like bureaucrats instead of engineers," Margaret replied without hesitation. "They're looking at existing facilities and trying to imagine marginal improvements. I'm talking about fundamentally changing how we approach naval construction." She opened her briefcase and withdrew a set of blueprints that she spread across Nimitz's desk. "These are plans for modular construction techniques that we've been developing since 1941. Instead of building each ship as a unique project, we create standardized components that can be assembled in multiple configurations." Margaret pointed to specific sections of the blueprints as she spoke. "A destroyer escort uses the same engine housing as a full destroyer, but with different armament and smaller crew quarters. A cargo vessel uses the same hull design as a transport ship, but with different internal configurations. By manufacturing these standardized components in dedicated facilities, we can reduce construction time by 60% while actually improving quality control." Admiral Nimitz studied the blueprints with growing interest. "This would require coordinating production across multiple facilities, which is exactly what I've been doing for the past 18 months, Margaret said. "Whitmore Shipbuilding doesn't just operate our own yards. We coordinate with 43 partner facilities across the East Coast. I've already tested these modular techniques on a limited scale, and the results exceed even my own projections." The Admiral looked up from the blueprints. "Why haven't you implemented this on a larger scale?" Margaret's expression hardened slightly. "Because every time we've proposed innovations to the Navy Department, we've been told that our job is to fill orders, not to redesign naval strategy. Your procurement staff treats us like a catalog service instead of recognizing that we understand ship construction better than anyone else in America." Nimitz was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of what she had said. "Mrs. Whitmore, if your modular construction techniques could be implemented across all civilian contractors, what kind of production increases are we talking about?" "Conservative estimates suggest we could double current output within 8 months, Margaret said. But that's not the most important advantage. The real benefit is flexibility. With modular construction, we can modify ship configurations based on changing tactical requirements. If you need more anti-submarine vessels, we can convert destroyer production lines in a matter of weeks rather than months. She withdrew another set of documents from her briefcase. This is a detailed analysis of Japanese shipping patterns in the Pacific based on intelligence data that my network has been collecting since 1942. Admiral Nimitz frowned. Your network? Margaret smiled for the first time during their meeting. Admiral, you don't build a successful business empire without developing excellent sources of information. I maintain relationships with shipping companies, port authorities, and maritime insurance brokers throughout the Pacific region. Many of them have been gathering intelligence on Japanese operations since long before Pearl Harbor. Are you telling me that a civilian contractor has been conducting intelligence operations? I'm telling you that a smart businesswoman has been paying attention to potential customers and competitors, Margaret replied smoothly. The fact that this information happens to be militarily useful is simply a fortunate coincidence. Nimitz picked up the intelligence report and began reading. Margaret watched his expression change as he realized the depth and accuracy of the information she had collected. Ship movements, supply schedules, construction priorities, fuel consumption patterns. It was the kind of detailed intelligence that could transform strategic planning. This intelligence suggests that Japanese naval production is already declining, Nimitz said after several minutes of reading. Their emphasis has shifted to defensive fortifications and land-based aircraft, which creates an opportunity, Margaret said. If we can accelerate our own ship production while the Japanese are scaling back theirs, we can achieve naval superiority in the Pacific much faster than anyone currently believes possible. She leaned forward, her intensity matching that of the Admiral himself. But only if we stop thinking like this is 1939 and start thinking like this is 1943. The war has changed, the technology has changed, and our capabilities have changed. The question is whether our planning can change quickly enough to take advantage of the opportunities we've created. Admiral Nimitz set down the intelligence report and studied Margaret carefully. Mrs. Whitmore, what exactly do you want from the Navy? I want partnership instead of patronage, Margaret said immediately. I want to be included in strategic planning sessions where ship requirements are determined. I want direct communication with Pacific commanders who can provide real-time feedback on vessel performance. And I want the authority to implement design improvements without waiting for bureaucratic approval from people who have never built a ship in their lives. In exchange for, Margaret's answer was immediate and comprehensive. In exchange, I guarantee that Whitmore Shipbuilding and our partner network will exceed every production target you set for 1944. I guarantee that our ships will incorporate the latest technological improvements in radar, sonar, and defensive systems. And I guarantee that we'll deliver vessels that are specifically designed for Pacific operations rather than generic designs that may or may not be suitable for the challenges your commanders face. She paused, letting the weight of her offer settle. More importantly, Admiral, I guarantee that we'll do all of this while maintaining the highest quality standards in the industry. My reputation has been built on delivering exactly what I promise, when I promise it. Admiral Nimitz was quiet for several minutes, staring out the window at the harbor where several of Margaret's ships were being loaded with supplies for the Pacific Fleet. When he finally spoke, his tone was that of a man who was making a decision that could change the course of the war. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm prepared to offer you something that no civilian contractor has ever been given. Direct access to Pacific Fleet planning sessions, real-time communication with field commanders, and the authority to modify ship specifications based on combat requirements. Margaret felt a surge of satisfaction, but she kept her expression neutral. What do you need in return? I need your complete production capacity dedicated to Pacific operations, Nimitz said firmly. No more Atlantic contracts, no more Mediterranean supply runs. Everything you build goes to support the island-hopping campaign. Agreed, Margaret said without hesitation. I also need your intelligence network to provide regular reports on Japanese shipping and construction activities, the Admiral continued. If you're going to have access to our strategic planning, we need access to your information sources. Also agreed. Nimitz stood and extended his hand across the desk. Then, we have a partnership, Mrs. Whitmore. God help us all if we're wrong about this. Margaret stood and shook his hand firmly. We're not wrong, Admiral. We're about to give the Pacific Fleet capabilities that the Japanese can't match and won't expect. As she gathered her documents and prepared to leave, Margaret thought about James, Robert, and William. Each of her husbands had died, believing that American innovation and determination could overcome any enemy. Now she was in a position to prove that they had been right. The Iron Widow had just become the secret weapon that would help win World War II. The only question was whether the United States Navy was ready for the changes she was about to bring to their war. 6 months later, Margaret stood on the deck of the USS Whitmore, a destroyer that bore her name and incorporated every innovation her engineers had developed since Pearl Harbor. The ship was preparing to leave Norfolk Naval Base for its maiden voyage to the Pacific, and Margaret was there to witness the culmination of everything she had worked to achieve since that fateful meeting with Admiral Nimitz. The transformation had been remarkable, even by Margaret's ambitious standards. Within 3 weeks of her partnership agreement with the Admiral, Whitmore Shipbuilding had restructured its entire operation around modular construction techniques. The 43 partner facilities that she coordinated had been converted to produce standardized components that could be assembled into multiple ship configurations. The results had exceeded even her most optimistic projections. Production numbers that had seemed impossible in November 1943 were now routine monthly achievements. The shipyards were delivering destroyers, escorts, and cargo vessels at rates that had astonished military planners and terrified Japanese intelligence officers who were struggling to understand how American naval production had suddenly accelerated so dramatically. But raw production numbers only told part of the story. The ships themselves were unlike anything that had ever sailed in the Pacific. They incorporated radar systems that could detect enemy aircraft at unprecedented distances, sonar equipment that could track submarines with pinpoint accuracy, and defensive armaments that could destroy incoming threats before they posed a danger to the fleet. More importantly, these ships had been designed specifically for Pacific operations. They carried additional fuel for extended operations, enhanced communications equipment for coordinating complex fleet movements, and modular weapon systems that could be reconfigured based on mission requirements. Every vessel that left Margaret's shipyards was a floating testament to what could be achieved when engineering excellence was combined with strategic vision. The USS Whitmore itself was the crown jewel of this transformation. From the outside, it looked like a standard Fletcher-class destroyer, but Margaret knew that appearances were deceiving. The ship incorporated experimental armor plating that could withstand direct hits from Japanese torpedoes, engines that could maintain flank speed for twice as long as comparable vessels, and radar systems that could simultaneously track air and surface targets while maintaining radio silence. As Margaret watched the crew make final preparations for departure, she was approached by Captain James Morrison, the ship's commanding officer. Morrison was a veteran of the Guadalcanal campaign who had personally requested assignment to the USS Whitmore after reading reports about its capabilities. Mrs. Whitmore, Captain Morrison said, saluting respectfully, "I wanted to thank you personally before we ship out. This vessel is unlike anything I've ever commanded, and my crew is eager to see how she performs in combat." Margaret returned his salute with a nod of acknowledgement. "Captain Morrison, this ship represents the best work of over 10,000 people who understand that winning this war requires more than courage and determination. It requires innovation, precision, and the willingness to challenge every assumption about naval warfare." She gestured toward the ship's superstructure, where new radar arrays were barely visible to casual observation. "Your radar systems can detect aircraft at ranges that would have been impossible 18 months ago. Your sonar can track submarines through thermal layers that would confuse older equipment. And your defensive systems can engage multiple targets simultaneously while maintaining formation with the rest of the fleet. Captain Morrison smiled grimly. The Japanese won't know what hit them. More importantly, Margaret replied, you'll know exactly what you're hitting. These ships don't just have better weapons, Captain. They have better information systems. You'll be fighting with advantages that the enemy can't match and won't expect. As they spoke, a young ensign approached with a telegram from Margaret. She read it quickly, then looked up at Captain Morrison with obvious satisfaction. Captain, you'll be interested to know that Admiral Nimitz has just authorized construction of 40 more vessels identical to this one. By the end of 1944, the Pacific Fleet will include an entire class of ships that incorporate our latest innovations. The implications were staggering. 40 ships might not sound like many compared to the hundreds of vessels already serving in the Pacific, but these weren't ordinary ships. They were floating laboratories that would provide real-time feedback on new technologies, tactical applications, and strategic possibilities that no one had ever imagined. Margaret had also ensured that each ship would be connected to a communication network that would allow her engineers to monitor performance data in real time. If a ship discovered a tactical advantage or encountered an unexpected challenge, that information would be transmitted immediately to her design teams, who could then implement improvements across the entire fleet. This feedback loop between combat operations and engineering development represented a completely new approach to naval warfare. Instead of waiting months or years to evaluate the effectiveness of new designs, Margaret's system would provide continuous updates that could drive rapid improvements in ship performance. Mrs. Whitmore, Captain Morrison said, I have to ask you something that's been bothering me since I received this assignment. Why did you name the ship after yourself? Most contractors name their vessels after politicians or war heroes. Margaret was quiet for a moment, thinking about James, Robert, and William. Each of them had died, believing that their work would help America win the war that was coming. Now, their innovations were sailing into combat aboard ships that bore her name. Captain, this ship doesn't just represent my work, she said finally. It represents the work of 3 men who died believing that American engineering could overcome any enemy. James Whitmore designed the hull configuration that makes this ship 40% faster than comparable destroyers. Robert Harrison developed the navigation systems that will help you find targets in conditions where other ships would be sailing blind. And William Thorne created the sonar technology that will keep enemy submarines from getting close enough to threaten your mission. She paused, watching as crew members moved efficiently across the deck in preparation for departure. I named this ship after myself because I'm the one who's still alive to see their work put to the test. But every time this ship engages the enemy, it will be honoring the memory of men who understood that wars are won by people who refuse to accept limitations. Captain Morrison nodded solemnly. Ma'am, I promise you that we'll make their sacrifice count. I know you will, Captain, Margaret replied. But more than that, I know you'll come home safely because you're sailing aboard the most advanced warship in the world. As the USS Whitmore prepared to cast off, Margaret thought about the conversation she had scheduled with Admiral Nimitz for the following week. The Pacific campaign was evolving faster than anyone had anticipated, and new opportunities were emerging that would require even more innovative solutions. The Japanese were beginning to realize that something fundamental had changed in American naval capabilities, but they didn't understand what that change represented. They were still thinking about World War II as if it were World War I fought with slightly better technology. They didn't realize that people like Margaret had transformed naval warfare into something entirely new. The Iron Widow had given the United States Navy capabilities that no enemy could match. Now it was time to use those capabilities to end the war on terms that would ensure a lasting peace. As the destroyer disappeared over the horizon, heading for combat operations that would test every innovation Margaret had developed, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She had honored the memory of her husbands by finishing the work they had started. Now it was up to the men and women of the Pacific Fleet to prove that American ingenuity could overcome any challenge. The war wasn't over yet, but Margaret was confident that it soon would be. The Iron Widow had done her job. Now it was time for others to do theirs. August 15th, 1945. The war was over. Margaret Whitmore stood in her private office overlooking the main shipyard in Norfolk, reading the telegram that officially announced Japan's surrender. After 4 years of unprecedented production, innovation, and sacrifice, the shooting had finally stopped. The harbor below was filled with ships bearing her company's name, vessels that had played crucial roles in campaigns from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima to the final assault on the Japanese mainland. The numbers were staggering even by Margaret's standards. Since her partnership with Admiral Nimitz had begun, Whitmore Shipbuilding and its network of partner facilities had delivered over 300 vessels to the Pacific Fleet. More importantly, those ships had incorporated technological advances that had fundamentally changed naval warfare. The modular construction techniques that skeptics had dismissed as impossible were now standard practice throughout the American shipbuilding industry. But the real measure of Margaret's success couldn't be found in production statistics or technological innovations. It could be found in the thousands of American sailors who had returned home alive because they had served aboard ships that could detect enemy threats sooner, survive enemy attacks better, and strike enemy targets more effectively than anything the Japanese could deploy. The USS Whitmore itself had become legendary throughout the Pacific Fleet. During 18 months of continuous combat operations, the destroyer had sunk 12 enemy vessels, rescued over 400 survivors from damaged ships, and provided radar guidance for fleet operations that had helped win decisive victories at the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf. More importantly, the ship had suffered 0 combat casualties, a record that Captain Morrison attributed directly to the advanced defensive systems that Margaret's engineers had installed. The success of the Whitmore and ships like it had validated every claim that Margaret had made during her confrontation with Admiral Nimitz's staff. The officers who had initially dismissed her as a grieving widow with delusions of competence now recognized her as one of the most important strategic thinkers of the war. Her insights into naval requirements had proven more accurate than those of professional military planners who had spent decades studying maritime warfare. As Margaret reflected on the war's end, she was interrupted by a knock on her office door. Her secretary announced that Admiral Nimitz himself had arrived for an unscheduled visit. Margaret had been expecting this conversation ever since the surrender announcement, and she was prepared for what she knew would be a difficult discussion about the future. Admiral Nimitz entered her office carrying a leather folder and wearing the expression of a man who was dealing with problems that extended far beyond military strategy. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, shaking her hand formally, "congratulations on an extraordinary achievement. Your contributions to our victory cannot be overstated." Margaret gestured for him to take a seat across from her desk. "Thank you, Admiral. But I suspect this isn't a social visit." Nimitz smiled grimly. "You're right, of course. I'm here because the War Department needs to discuss the future of your operation. With Japan surrendered, we're facing a complete transformation of our naval requirements." Margaret had been anticipating this conversation since the moment Germany surrendered 3 months earlier. The government wants to scale back civilian naval production now that the emergency is over. "It's more complicated than that," Nimitz replied. "Congress is demanding immediate cuts in military spending, which means that most of our wartime contracts will be canceled within 90 days. At the same time, the Navy Department recognizes that your innovations represent capabilities that we'll need to maintain for future security challenges." He opened the leather folder and withdrew a thick document. "This is a proposal for a new kind of partnership between the Navy and civilian contractors. Instead of the traditional procurement relationship, we're suggesting a permanent arrangement where selected companies maintain research and development capabilities that can be activated quickly if new threats emerge." Margaret read through the proposal quickly, recognizing immediately that this was both an opportunity and a trap. The Navy wanted to maintain access to her engineering capabilities without paying for the full infrastructure that those capabilities required. They wanted to keep her innovations available for future use, while dramatically reducing the financial commitment that had made those innovations possible. Admiral, Margaret said carefully, this proposal assumes that advanced naval technology can be maintained in a state of suspended animation, ready to be activated whenever the government decides it's needed. But that's not how engineering works. She stood and moved to a large window that overlooked the shipyard where thousands of workers were already beginning to wonder about their job security. Innovation requires continuous investment, ongoing research, and practical application. If you shut down 90% of my operation and then try to restart it 5 years from now, you'll discover that the knowledge and expertise have been lost. Nimitz nodded slowly. That's exactly what I told the War Department, but they're more concerned with immediate budget reductions than long-term strategic planning. They assume that if we need advanced naval capabilities in the future, we can simply rebuild them using the techniques we've developed during this war. Margaret turned back to face the Admiral. They're wrong, and you know they're wrong. The innovations we've created aren't just technical specifications that can be filed away and retrieved later. They're the result of years of experimentation, testing, and refinement by teams of engineers who understand naval requirements better than anyone else in America. She moved back to her desk and picked up a different folder containing documents that she had prepared specifically for this conversation. Admiral, I've been planning for this moment since 1944. I know that the government wants to demobilize as quickly as possible, but I also know that the world isn't going to return to the peaceful conditions that existed before Pearl Harbor. Margaret opened her folder and withdrew a comprehensive analysis that her intelligence network had been developing since Germany's surrender. The Soviet Union is already deploying naval forces in ways that suggest they're preparing for future conflicts with Western powers. They've been studying our innovations throughout the war, and they're working to develop countermeasures that could neutralize our current advantages. Admiral Nimitz frowned as he read through the intelligence report. Mrs. Whitmore, are you suggesting that we're going to be at war with the Soviet Union? I'm suggesting that the next war won't be fought like this one. Margaret replied firmly. It will be fought by powers that understand advanced technology, sophisticated intelligence operations, and global logistics. The innovations that gave us victory over Japan will be obsolete within 10 years, unless we continue developing new capabilities. She withdrew another document from her folder. This is a proposal for maintaining advanced naval research and development capabilities without the massive infrastructure that current production requires. Instead of keeping all 43 partner facilities operational, we maintain core engineering teams and research facilities that can develop new technologies continuously. Margaret had spent months developing this alternative to the government's demobilization plans. These research teams would work on next-generation naval systems that anticipate future threats rather than responding to current requirements. When new challenges emerge, we'll already have solutions ready for implementation instead of starting from scratch. Admiral Nimitz studied her proposal carefully. This would still require significant ongoing investment from the Navy Department. It would require intelligent investment rather than massive investment. Margaret corrected. The cost of maintaining research capabilities is a fraction of the cost of rebuilding those capabilities after they've been lost. More importantly, this approach ensures that America maintains its technological advantage over potential enemies who are certainly not demobilizing their own research efforts. The Admiral was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing the political realities that he faced against the strategic necessities that Margaret was describing. Finally, he looked up from her proposal with the expression of a man who was making a decision that he knew would be controversial. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm going to recommend that the Navy Department accept your proposal, he said firmly. But I need you to understand that this means you'll be operating under much greater scrutiny than you experienced during the war. There will be oversight committees, budget reviews, and political pressure that could make your life very complicated. Margaret smiled for the first time since the Admiral had arrived. Admiral, I've been dealing with complicated situations my entire adult life. I think I can handle a few politicians who don't understand naval engineering. There's one more thing, Nimitz said. The Navy Department wants to offer you a formal position as a civilian advisor to the Chief of Naval Operations. It will be the first time in Navy history that a civilian contractor has been given direct input into strategic planning on a permanent basis. Margaret felt a surge of satisfaction that she carefully kept from showing on her face. What will my responsibilities include? Everything we've been doing since our partnership began, the Admiral replied. Technology development, strategic planning, intelligence analysis, and coordination with allied naval forces. But now it would be official, permanent, and recognized at the highest levels of government. As Margaret considered the offer, she thought about James, Robert, and William. Each of them had died, believing that American innovation could overcome any enemy. Now she was being offered the opportunity to ensure that their legacy would continue to protect American interests for generations to come. I accept, Margaret said without hesitation. But I have one condition. Admiral Nimitz raised an eyebrow. What's that? I want the title Iron Widow included in my official position description, Margaret said with a slight smile. It's taken me 47 years to earn that reputation. I don't intend to abandon it now. The Admiral laughed, the first time Margaret had seen him genuinely amused since their partnership began. I think that could be arranged, Mrs. Whitmore. Welcome to the peacetime Navy. As Admiral Nimitz left her office, Margaret looked out at the harbor where ships bearing her name were preparing for their transition to peacetime service. The war was over, but her work was just beginning. The Iron Widow had helped win World War II. Now it was time to start preparing for whatever conflicts the future might bring. The age of American naval supremacy was just beginning, and Margaret Whitmore intended to make sure it lasted for generations to come.